Who's Shinzoing my Abe? I get it. The guy who was assassinated with a homemade electronic blunderbuss, and much like the one true hero, we are going to also clutch together this electronic blunderbuss of a plane, the MiG-29 SMT. We're going to make a sim guide for it because one currently doesn't exist. And with my previous video, this plane got a little bit of a bad reputation because it is a little bit heavy. The flight models are different than before. And there are a lot of limitations with the way that this plane plays, mainly due to the flight model and also just due to the way that your team is set up. With the current popularity of all of the US planes, the F-16C, the F-16A, the F-14B, if you're flying this thing, you're going to find yourself in more or less a +4 disadvantage. The US team is going to have more players, and that's going to make things relatively difficult. The maneuvering performance of this plane is relatively limited compared to a lot of the US things that you face. It does not take a lot of effort for an F-16C pilot or an F-16A pilot to just push your shit in a dogfight. Fortunately, we have the benefit that the skill gap in sim is quite high, that the likelihood of you running into very, very competent dogfighters in F-16s is relatively low. And against most of the player base, there are ways to utilize the advantages of this plane and utilize the advantages of its kit to be able to go out and get some kills. So it is not completely relegated to being unplayable, but you are going to experience some difficulty. Now, one of the best ways to mitigate some of this difficulty is to pick maps that are especially well suited to this plane and well suited to kind of like flying below the radar and using terrain to your advantage. Vietnam is probably the best top tier sim map for that. You have multiple routes that you can fly and stick into valleys and kind of like duck in between mountains so that you're not always lit up by the entire map like you are in something like Denmark. So let's talk about what the SMT actually brings to the table. The main draw for the SMT is that it brings new weapons to the game. It brings the R-73 and it brings the R-27ET, the thermal version of the R-27ER. The R-27ET is not really a huge advantage, it is situational, but the R-73 is a much needed improvement for the MiG-29 airframe as far as its viability in sim. Previously, with the drag nerfs to the R-60M, you were really limited with 4 missiles at very, very close range, and they were really easy to defeat with countermeasures. Now, with the R-73, you have a missile that functions pretty well at medium ranges. It's about as on par with the AIM-9L as far as range goes, but it is very, very lethal up close because of the IRCCM, the infrared countermeasure. The other thing that the SMT brings to the table is that it has a more capable radar than the regular MiG-29. The deflection limit for this thing, it can go a full 90 degrees left, a full 90 degrees right, which in theory is very helpful for being able to fire an R-27ER while simultaneously guiding it and notching the enemy's missile. Now, this feature, with the way that sim currently plays, is I don't think is as big of a deal as some people make it out to be, because in situations where your team is basically at a +4 disadvantage, going to altitude is a good way to catch radar missiles from multiple angles that you just can't notch them all at the same time. Of any of the planes in the game, the MiG-29 SMT has probably the most features available inside of the cockpit. You have the IRST system, you have the radar, you have all of the different radar modes, and you have the helmet-mounted the sight. While all this sounds really good on paper, it is very easy to get caught up flying the MiG-29 almost exclusively in the cockpit and trying to figure out how to use the different systems and actually leverage them into some kind of advantage. In reality, I think the best way to play this plane is you need to simplify your information management down to the features that end up being actually useful. Now, what I do is I take the radar and I limit it more or less to TWS. I find TWS mode to be the most useful because you can get the bearing of the enemy player as well as their altitude and their location just through the HUD as well. All of the other modes, they might have a use, but in reality, spending your time switching between different radar screens is time that you're not paying attention to other things that might be more important, like the RWR or just like what's going on outside of your cockpit. The other thing that I do is I put the button controls for switching the different radar types between IRST and ACM mode and etc. I put them on my thumbstick so that I can easily get between TWS to locking to switching to IRST and stuff like that, because the ACM modes are actually fairly useful, especially after the merge. And in the current spotting system where planes are really difficult to see, if you can get them to fly through the ACM box, they're going to pop up back up on the HUD and you'll be able to track people even if you can't necessarily see them. And then the final thing that I do is I try to really leverage the helmet mounted sight in the R-73 while using them in a dogfight. And what I've found is really the best way to get these missiles to lock on is to turn on IRST, but then don't lock people up with IRST. Just use the missile seeker head itself if you have like a visual confirmation of like where they're at. Just use IRST to get visual back on them once you lose sight of them. And then if you're already behind them, yeah, fine, use IRST. But if you already have visual, just use the missile seeker head. That seems to be the best method that I've found so far. That way you're not getting any false locks from TWS or having your IRST accidentally pick up someone that is also nearby. Speaking of dogfights, we're in one right now. We are fighting an F-14. We merged, we lost sight of him, we ended up giving him R6, and he came in behind us, and he's in the process of more or less getting ready to eat our ass. But one of the things that I'm doing is I'm kind of doing an energy-based turn. I'm not turning as hard as I can. I'm getting a little bit of space on him, getting around the circle just a little bit quicker. But what I'm eventually going to do is I'm going to shed my speed, and I'm going to try to force him to overshoot in the trajectory. Like right here, we see him go around. He's turning a much larger circle. He's got his afterburner out. And this is where that helmet mount display comes in handy. We put the helmet mount display on. We shoot the first missile. It doesn't always track, but because he's shot out in front of us, because he's giving us a clear sight of his engine, and he's going really slow now, he's going to end up eating this R-73. And that really is the advantage of the helmet-mounted sight, is that you can get these missiles off faster, you can get them off at different angles that people can't really anticipate, and if they're close to you, and the missile can see their burner, it's kind of a free kill. Now, the downside to it is that because the plane sheds so much speed, by the time we got to that shot, we were going 250 kph. For anyone that is a third party, we are more or less a free kill. That's why this plane really needs to be played very fast, and it needs to be played as more or less like a hit-and-run fighter, because once you get more than one plane involved, unless you're really lucky with your missile launches and the helmet-mounted sight, it's very easy to end up going basically at no speed in front of someone, and you just die. Even in the 1v1, most planes have advantages that they can play against you, because you're just kind of, you're a fast boat with 1 to 2 reasonably good turns. Now, if you can plan those turns out, you can do good, but this is usually typically the result, is you make one turn, you look at one guy, and the second guy is going to be there to kill you. In reality, in that situation, what I should have done is I should have stuck lower to the valley, let the first guy fly past, and then maybe attack the second guy, and then just use the top speed of this plane to maintain distance and get away from people. This ends up being a lot easier said than done, especially on your flat maps. They're kind of pointless. If you're down 4, everyone kind of knows where you're at. Denmark, all the spawns are consolidated basically into one corner of the map. It's all ocean, and playing on that map with this plane at the disadvantages that you have is a very painful experience. That's why I play Vietnam. You get the kind of sort of cinematic DCS flying through the mountains experience, and while you're flying below these mountains, you're not popping up on everybody's radar screen. This is also why I limit the scan pattern, the scan angle of the radar itself to something relatively narrow, because I can use the RWR to get a bearing on an enemy target, and then I can direct the beam at them, and then I'm not lighting up everyone else on the map and saying, hey, I'm over here, please come shoot all your missiles at me, please, I'm the only person playing right now. The only real downside to Vietnam is the color palette of the map itself makes visual spotting very, very difficult. If you've paid attention to the video, you've probably noticed that multiple times I have merged with someone, and they're not immediately invisible, but finding them is almost based on motion cues and just experience itself. A lot of the times I'm not really spotting them, more or less that I'm just detecting slight movement on the screen that makes me a little bit suspicious, and then I am able to lock them up. This is going to be a pretty good example of how quickly you can lose targets in Vietnam. Like, I'm using IRST, I'm trying to get this guy on the radar screen. Like, I know that he's there, and as we pass, we look at him, and right there, he's gone. He just completely vanishes off of the screen. And this is what current spotting is like. We get him on the radar screen again, we get the track pulse Doppler, we know that he's running away, and we're trying to look at him, and we have switched to the wrong thing, and we have lost him. And our counter to this is we're just gonna fly away. We're just gonna fly away and try to reapproach this, go maybe for the F-16 or the F-14 that's behind us, that is pinging us with the radar, because we did make that vertical loop, which definitely someone probably noticed that. If they didn't notice that, they probably saw my anxiety flare. So we're just gonna kind of leave the area and come back in a little bit, and come back just from a different angle. One of the things that I forgot to mention is that the R-27 ET and the R-73 they're kind of finicky. There are certain situations where they just kind of decide to not actually work. This is a pretty good situation. I went and watched the replay, and both of these missiles more or less tracked and went through this guy's plane, but they just didn't detonate, because there's some logic in the game that says the moisture content in the air was slightly too high, because it is technically through a cloud, and we just didn't end up getting the kill there. Now, he went and smashed himself into the ground, so we're gonna count it. It's a net positive for the team, and we're just gonna keep moving on. Now, this is gonna be a pretty generic kill with an R-73. We have an F-16 that is running away. We have him locked up on the radar. We're trying to convince him that we're gonna shoot a radar missile, but we're gonna shoot a heat seeker at him instead. And the thing that I want people to pay attention to is that on the left side of the HUD, you have the two thick bars that are kind of like your ranging brackets, and then your arrow kind of represents the hit probability of your missile. As long as that arrow is between those two lines, you have a pretty good chance of hitting the target. I am sure someone will have a more precise answer for exactly what the engagement criteria is and how it is represented on the HUD, and whether or not the bottom line is a distance where the target will not be able to decoy the missile or defeat the missile at all, or if it is a minimum engaging distance. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I don't speak Russian. I just know put the arrow between the two lines, launch the missile, and you have a pretty good chance of scoring a kill. And we're looking for a new target to engage. We see some exhaust, and now we get a jump scare. We hear a brrrr, and this is an F-14 that has glued himself to our 6. The rear cockpit visibility of this thing is pretty terrible, but this guy just overshoots, and he just flies in front, and at close range, it really doesn't matter how much of his flares he dumps, because the missile sees his tailpipe, and he's just gone. And that is like one of the most interesting aspects of the helmet-mounted displays. You can react very quickly to bad situations, so it really does help redeem this plane. The R-73 isn't the only good missile that this thing gets. It is probably the most useful, but something like the R-27 ET does bring some situational ability to the table. Now, with the ET, what I have found is that coupling it up with an R-27R is not really the move, because it is relatively easy to flare at a distance. Like, at the distances where you'd be using it as like the sniper missile, you really want to launch the ET first, and really at targets that are oblivious, kind of like at medium altitude, like that guy was right there. If they're on the deck, it's very likely that the guidance logic, if the guy even points his nose down, is going to cause the missile to crash anyways. But targets like that, it's really good, it's really reliable. Whether or not it brings more to the table and is more useful than carrying, say for instance, two R-27ERs, or if it's better than carrying, say, another R-73, it's kind of situational, but I figured I'd just throw that in there just to help you guys kind of visualize what the R-27 ET is capable of and like what situations it's useful in. Now, this is going to be the last fight of the game. We are carrying 6 R-73s, so we're going to be very liberal in their application. We're going to shoot one in the head-on. If this guy flares, he's going to make it through. And once we merge, the fight is on. Now, I do my standard high yo-yo turn, try to find him with the sight. As soon as I lock him up, I'm going to try to shoot a second missile. He is spiraling up. and he's pulling a lag turn. He is more or less kind of doing what he needs to do, but his turning circle is larger than ours, and we're able to kind of sit inside of it. But if he plays it correctly, he's going to get behind us, and we are going to run out of energy. We're going to be hopeless. But in the meantime, we can utilize the helmet sight to really force him to sweat it out a little bit. As you can see there, after about 2 turns, though, we're kind of helpless. We did use our stick very aggressively. We wanted to end the fight very quickly, and now we're kind of in a really bad situation here, because once he gets his nose on here, if he gets the shot, if he hits these, the fight is over. But he misses, and because we're going slow, because we deployed the air brake, we get a counterattack. And that's one of the issues that sim players have, is they're not necessarily all that good at the low speed fight, and you can kind of utilize that against them. So even though this thing's a little bit of a boat, you can kind of learn how to sail it around. And in that instance, we sailed it around, and we kind of sailed an R-73 right up his ass, and that's going to be the rest of the game. We have finished with 8 kills, 1 death. The 1 death was to a fairly amateurish mistake, but this game is also exceptional. This game is one of those games where I was lucky enough to not be engaged by more than 4 people at the same time, and I'm on one of the good maps. Now, in reality, is this plane good? It's probably the 4th best plane behind like all of the F-16 variants. It might be slightly worse than the Mirage 2000 depending on the circumstances. I do think the missile loadout on this is a lot more applicable to sim, but the Mirage 2000 might be really good. I really want it, which is why you should like and subscribe to my channel, so that I can get the Mirage 2000 without having to actually grind and play France. Anyways, that's a video. Hopefully you can play the MiG-29 SMT and not want to kill yourself.